Great. So we are off and rolling. Thank you everyone for joining. I very much appreciate your time. I appreciate our panelists' time. We might not take the full hour today. It depends on how many questions we get, because we really want to make this as interactive as possible. So the session you've signed up for today is Inclusive Research, Universal Gains, How to Elevate Insights for All. And our goal today is really to introduce the expert panel that we have brought together today, and talk a little bit about best practices for a few different audiences of focus. So that's where we're going to start. We're going to start with some conversation about some very specific audiences or sections of the audience and some best practices to meet their needs. And then segue that into discussing how following those audience-specific best practices can help research with all audiences overall. So that's really the goal. The goal is to pull together what helps specific audiences and how that may help general audiences as well. This has been a theme throughout the conference season this year. So we wanted to pull together some great speakers and thought leaders, and have a little meeting of the minds. There will be plenty of time for Q&A. We're actually going to do it a little bit differently today. We're going to have an internal Q&A where the panelists ask each other questions, followed by an audience Q&A. So keep those questions coming in the Q&A section, and we'll be able to pop those in throughout. A little bit about me, your host today, Katrina Noelle. I'm president of No Research and co-founder of Scoot Insights. And at both of my agencies, we take inclusive insights very seriously. And so we do a lot in the industry to be a good ally and pass the mic and make sure all voices are heard, as many voices as possible in any particular project that we get our hands on. So I've been really enlightened and inspired by the speakers today and wanted to make sure that I gave them an extra platform to speak with all of you. So I would love it, panelist team, if you could do a quick introduction of yourself and what you're here to talk about and the audience you're here to enlighten us about. And Dawn, can we start with you?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm so excited to be here. I am one of the ones stuck in the travel thing, so I apologize for the darkness. I'm in a hotel, a really random hotel in Oklahoma. So I'm so excited to be here. That was the best part of the day. My name is Dawn Carr. I am founder and CEO of Mahogany Insights. We are a strategy and market research firm that is focused primarily on the needs of Black consumers and understanding and ensuring that those voices are heard and that there's a strong connection or a strong understanding between brands and those voices. Most recently, we founded Mahogany Minds, which is a market research platform with really the focus of how do we get more Black respondents into research and doing research. We know that's a gap. And so our focus is specifically around a platform that, that focuses on research recruiting with Black consumers. So that's me, and I'm based in Dallas.
Fabulous. Thank you. Over to Maria.
Thank you, Katrina. I am Maria Parra. I am the founder and principal of Ingenium Research. I've been doing research for 25 years now. I started my career 25 years ago back in Colombia, where I had the opportunity to conduct research across Latin America in different countries, including Venezuela, when Venezuela was an important market to do research. Well, it's still important, it's just that it's difficult to conduct research there. And then moved to the United States 20 years ago. Didn't know I was going to continue working on research or not, that I was just moving here for personal reasons. And being here as a researcher, being able to moderate and do groups in Spanish was actually a great advantage. So I decided to continue my career, but especially focus on the Hispanic market. That's what I've been doing for the past 20 years. Founded Ingenium Research 13 years ago with the purposes of helping clients to better understand Hispanic audiences. We do both qualitative and quantitative research here at Ingenium Research.
Beautiful. Thank you. Dana.
Hello, I'm Dana Keilman, and I am one of the co-founders, along with Nicole Muncie, of Morning Light Strategy. We started this initiative up really based on the realization across both of our careers in insights. Mine spans about 25 years, that clients very often want to focus on the up and coming consumers, the Gen Z and now millennials are too old, but a lot of Gen Z focus, when we know that the purchasing power and the actual growth of the population is really concentrated more in the older population. So looking at age 50 plus. And that's what we do. So we do research among really all ages, but we focus on that older consumer and understand how helping them can have a spillover effect across generations and across ages.
Fantastic. And not last but not least, Kristen.
Hey everyone, apologies for also being in a travel situation. I am in the truly beautiful town of Fruta, Colorado. It's a long story. I am a vice president doing custom research, focused primarily but not exclusively in the technology sector. I've been with buzzback a little over 9 months, and part of what I do at buzzback is represent. I'm one of the representatives on the market research vendor side for the Accessible Insights Consortium, which is a consortium that Verizon started in 2023. And they started it because there was an understanding that we needed to have a collective effort across all of us in the research industry, including recruitment, panel providers, platforms, research vendors, like all of us on the phone and myself, as well as clients, because there was a recognition that we are not doing all we need to do to make sure that research is accessible to people with disabilities. And that is no short order, because as we all know, the idea of people with disabilities spans almost 1 in 4 Americans, everything from cognitive challenges to low vision to mobility issues, and you name it. So I've been proud to be a member of that consortium, and I'm here today to contribute to talk about people with disabilities and how we make research designed that welcomes them in.
And I do have to say, we could represent, 14 more special target audiences of note. This is a selection. This is a selection of the target groups that you may encounter in studies and that you want to make sure are included in studies, but by no means is this list of 4 audiences inclusive. We could probably do a webinar series to make sure we covered all the audiences that need to be included in research, but we thought it was a good starting point. So we're going to go kind of in the order of those introductions, just to give a quick run through of some of the key best practices for each of these audiences, and then we'll kind of get the how all of these best practices can play together. So let's go ahead, back to you, Dawn.
Yeah. Okay, so when we talked about what were some of those kind of key principles that we think about when we are recruiting and doing research around Black audiences, there's really 3 that come to mind. So the first that are a little bit different beyond the like very sort of straightforward pieces. And one of them is around this idea that diversity within race should be considered in design, recruiting, and execution. So a lot of the times we talk about Black as a race. So like I get clients who say, I want to talk to Black consumers. And I say, okay, tell me more. And they're like, well, all Black people between, this age and this age. And one of the things that we like to talk about is the fact that like these consumers, just like with white consumers and Hispanic consumers and all over, are not monolithic, right? That there are differences. And there's even a difference in what we would talk about in ethnicities, which is something that's a little trickier that people don't often think about with Black consumers. Often there's this idea of like, one of the things we talk about is a little bit about like, how do you define? And so there are pieces that are, some people say African American, some people say Black. What we would say at Mahogany Insights is that Black is the race, African American is an ethnicity. So you can be Black and African American, but you can also be Black and Nigerian American or Black and Haitian American, et cetera. And those are very different in terms of their relationship with the US, how they got here, their interaction, their thoughts, their feelings, all of that impacts everything. So when we try to recruit, we are actually looking for a spectrum of Black consumers, not just anyone who says Black, but that it is more representative of what Black consumers are, which is about 88% African American and then about 12% others. The second thing that we talk about is this idea of understanding and accounting for a power imbalance. And this is a big thing that happens just in general, right? Like a lot of Black people who are raised, particularly African Americans, which is why we look for that broad spectrum when we're recruiting. That there is, I always say, there's a complicated relationship between Black people and in America, and that Black people often don't make a distinguish between America and corporate America, or anyone who is in a position of power, which means that if you are doing focus groups, for example, and you sit at the head of the table, you are automatically in a position of power. So everything that you wear, whether it is your skin color, your hair, your texture, your gender, all of that stuff is also communicating a position of power. And we are often signaled, whether it's consciously or subconsciously, to behave differently when that position of power doesn't feel like it could potentially be an ally for us. So if you walk into a room and you are a white male, you could be a huge ally for us, but our first idea might be that you might not be. And so how we talk and behave in research can be very different in one group or the other. So I always say, like, just be aware of that, and so that you understand that there could be differences in how people say things and interact with you based on how they view their power dynamic in that room. And then the last thing is this idea that the expertise in understanding the Black consumer isn't just about how you recruit and whether or not you have a Black moderator if you're doing qualitative research, or someone who's designing the study look at it if you're doing quant. It's also, I think, even more important that you have that representation in the analysis piece, and especially if you are doing quant, because what happens is that we see numbers, we see data, we don't often have the why behind that number and data. Our brains want to create a why behind it, and so whether we are consciously or unconsciously doing it, sometimes those biases of what we think could happen. And so it is really great if you can make sure that as you're looking at the analysis piece, that you have representation there and you don't forget that, because that's ultimately the piece that people are making their decisions on, right? It's what actually happens afterwards. So I think all of those things kind of carry into every other group, right? Like as you're thinking about making sure there's representation throughout the process, making sure we understand how our consumers feel when we're in these rooms, and then understanding that diversity is more than just race, right? Even within race, there are other complexities there, and that we're actually going the mile behind it. That's what I would say for Black consumers.
Yeah, I think we hear that quite a lot on our the podcast trip, the Research Inclusion Project, that we hear it continually about this analysis phase, that it's overlooked from an inclusivity standpoint, that really looking through the data and storytelling and conveying those insights and really understanding what's going on beneath the surface to make sure that you have a, you know, an audience representative or someone knowledgeable about the audience in question involved in that stage too. I think that's really important.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wonderful. Okay. Maria.
Thank you. So there are so many similarities with the Black audiences when we think about Hispanic audiences as well. So to Dawn's point, we always try to differentiate between race and ethnicity, because race is more about physical characteristics such as the skin color, the hair texture, or facial features, and ethnicity relates more to cultural factors such as nationality, culture, language, and beliefs. With Hispanic, it's tricky because we put everything together under the Hispanic term, when in reality, within Hispanics, there is also diversity. And I also want to clarify some terms or some key definitions that sometimes are defined as the same, but they're slightly different. Like, for instance, Hispanic is related to people that come from Spanish-speaking countries. So in this case, this includes Spain and countries in Latin America where Spanish is the predominant language, but this definition excludes Brazil from there. Then we have the Latino term that is more related from people that are from Latin America, regardless of the language. So in this case, when we talk about Latinos or Latinas, we are including Brazil here, but we're excluding Spain. And then there is a newer term that is the Latinx, that is a gender-neutral alternative, very common lately. It's still polarizing. What I have seen doing research is that if I talk to younger generations, more acculturated generations, they like it. But if I talk to older generations, more Spanish dominant generations, they don't like it, especially because it's difficult to pronounce in Spanish. I don't even know how to pronounce it in Spanish. So after that one-on-one Hispanic in 2 minutes that I could take an entire presentation talking about this, there is also diversity inside the Hispanic community. Like, usually when we think about Hispanics, the first thing that we think is that it's Mexicans. And when I moved to the United States 20 years ago, Mexican was the biggest country of origin. Approximately 80% of the Hispanics were from Mexico. It's still the most important one, but now it's 60% of the Hispanic population. So when we think about diversity, we think about country of origins, that it has Mexico, but also have different countries from the Caribbean, from Central America, from South America as well. Also, the diversity is also related to the area of the U.S. region, like of the U.S. region. Like the East Coast is more diverse. We have people from South America and the Caribbean, some Mexicans. Then the West Coast is predominantly Mexican, and then the Midwest is predominantly Mexican with some diversity. And then we talk about acculturation levels. Some clients are moving away from acculturation, but it's still a key concept. And acculturation is related to on how much you have assimilated the culture. How many years have you spent here in the United States? If you were born in the United States, or you're a second or third generation. So those are things that you have to consider when you are designing the research. That's the first thing I always recommend, because usually what everyone thinks, okay, we're going to include Hispanics, but what exactly are you including? And what is your key segment when you are thinking about Hispanics? Because it could be only Mexicans, or it's a diverse audience. Do you want first generation or second generation? And let's add ages as well. So there are so many things that we have to keep into consideration when we are designing the project scope and considering that diversity within this audience. The other one is partner with the experts, with people that understand the Hispanic market, that understand this diversity. What I have seen many clients, the challenges that many clients mentioned that they have been facing is because when they do the research, they don't find the correct partner, the person that understands the audiences, and they ended up having second generation Hispanics that speak only English, that maybe still have some attachment with the Hispanic culture, but it's not the same. So for the same reason, when they try to find cultural nuances or things that are significantly different than other audiences, it could be the same because they have acculturated. So when you partner with the ones that understand really the culture, that also guarantees that you are going to have more diversity. Like I have faced that myself, especially with quantitative panels. When I try to do quantitative research and I speak to different panels, all of them, the first one, when I ask, okay, how about your Hispanic capabilities? All of them tell me, oh, I have Hispanic capabilities. But when I start digging and trying to understand, okay, tell me about the percentage of Mexicans that you have here, or the language, or the country of origin in general, or where I'm mostly concentrated. Like I was in a research project a few years ago where I didn't have much Mexicans, even though it's the biggest Hispanic population. And most of the sample was more in the East Coast, that is important, but the West Coast is even most important. So make sure that when you are working with a supplier or with another partner, make sure that they do understand this diversity. That makes the difference. And also dedicate the time to and space to understand Hispanics. It's not the same, and it also always depends on the objectives of your research, but it's not the same to include a couple of Hispanics within a group or as part of the project scope than dedicating and the time to conduct one group with only Hispanics, or one part of the sample that only includes Hispanics and some kind of diversity. Those are like my key recommendations, but again, this could take an hour to discuss it.
I realize I'm having everyone do a speed round, so I do appreciate that. But I also want to say, I think that's a really important point to underscore, of having conversations with suppliers. And that's whether you're brand side, or if you're like we are all in this supplier sandwich, right, situation, to not just say, oh yeah, you do? Great. You've got those people. To ask tough questions and to make sure that you're vetting, to make sure what you think you're being given is, up to the quality standards. Dawn, were you going to say?
Yeah, and I love that. And I was like vigorously nodding because I found that is an issue with Black consumers too. That and that was why that first point about the fact that we're different is so important, because no one, that follow-up question about Black, what's your ethnicity, probably the same with Hispanic, where are you from, or your country of origin, is so critical, because even with Black people, someone who is Nigerian American behaves much more, has much more similarities to immigrant populations than they do in many cases to African Americans. And so if you don't know what you're getting, which in our case, sometimes we would get 30% of our people in a qual group are immigrant population, first or second generation here versus African American. It's just a different experience. And it's so important to just be able to like question those suppliers to make sure that you really understand who those audiences are beyond just the like check the box, Hispanic, Black, etc. So I love that point.
And for you could be even more challenging than, because in my
Mhm.
case, sometimes the groups have to be in Spanish. They actually need a Hispanic moderator. But with the Black audiences, since they speak English, sometimes they replace the Black moderator or the Black expert. And it's not the same. When I include Black audiences within research projects, I always partner with a Black moderator, because it's not about, and we all know this, but it's not only about going and moderate groups, that anyone can do that, but understanding that those cultural nuances are different. And also the way that they engage with you is different when you are a Black or a Hispanic moderator than when you're a white moderator, even if you speak the language perfectly.
Absolutely.
And I think this also brings us to the idea of this intersectionality that we as a group have talked about, because if we go from a race or ethnicity lens to the next two target audiences, we're layering this on, right? So then we've got multiple races and ethnicities within the other two, what we're calling specific target audiences. So it gets very complex, right? All of the kind of overlapping categories. So Dana, take us to regardless of race or ethnicity, we all get older, right?
We hope so. Yeah. That's and following on intersectionality, this is, absolutely what defines older adults. So of course, if you're lucky, you get older, and you also, as you start to get into your 40s and your 50s, you also are likely to have parents getting older. So your relationship to the older audience changes as you change and as life goes on. So definitely intersectionality is something to think about here, and just recognize that you're really capturing all these different experiences across, income is one thing that really plays a role in people's different experiences as they get older and potentially, significantly older. So, but back to best practices, if I think about kind of top 3 points for best practices among mature audiences, one of the questions that Nicole and I get a lot is, how do you get in touch with people? Because they're not online. Older people are not online, and actually, generally they are. Even going up to age 85 or so, there's a lot of nuance about who might not be online. But if we look at smartphone ownership, we look at internet usage, we look at even social media, there are a lot of very consistent numbers, even when we're comparing age 65 plus with Generation Z, for example. So online might not always be the right option for you. There's some good reasons why sometimes it may not be if you really need to be more in person with people, but your audience is very likely to be more tech savvy than you initially are thinking. Also, I will say, when we're talking about mature audiences, we really are starting at age 50 and going all the way up, into 90s. So there's a whole lot of variability in there too. But I want to emphasize, even people in their 80s have smartphones, the majority. So think about who's making the purchase decision for your product. And years ago, I used to do a lot of research with parents and kids, and that was just something that we understood how to do. We would want to talk to the parent, but also get the kids' input, because the parent's not going to be very interested in buying if the kid is not interested in whatever this is. And it's a similar dynamic here as well, although it's possible that it's flipped now. So often you've got somebody, especially if it's a more tech item, where you may have the adult child as the decision maker and the person who has identified that this could really be a good solution to a particular need. So that end user may not ultimately be your purchase decision maker. Don't assume that they're not, but just be open-minded to realizing that you may want to include someone else, a caregiver or the adult child, in the study as well. And then think about the marketing target for your organization. And I know, Gen Z is really a key focus. Gen Z and millennials are age-wise a key focus for a lot of different companies. But look at that and challenge what would happen if you started to flip that around and look at more of a typically underserved audience, which would be 50 plus in general. I'll say people age 50 plus account for over half of consumer spending, but they get 5% of advertising dollars. So I'm just putting that in perspective. Think about how the spotlight is not there, but they're actually responsible for driving a lot of the purchases, and then also, of course, influencing a lot of the purchases. And the last point in that bucket that I would put out there is, if everyone is focusing on Gen Z and your organization is doing the same, what are you learning and how are you really differentiating your offer from what your competitors offer? If you go and you really examine the needs of a different audience and understand how those needs can relate across different age groups, then you're likely to come up with more innovative ideas and deeper insights, frankly.
And Kiana's mentioned this in the chat as well. And then that it trickles down, right? Then they're not represented in advertising, and then they don't feel seen and heard by brands. And then, yeah, so I think it has a lot of repercussions. I think we have to remember when we're doing market research that we're feeding into marketing. And, like that is the funnel, that is what happens. So sometimes, really fighting the good fight to make sure that we put voices into the top of the funnel so that they then hear from the brand according to their needs.
And to follow on that, I think something that's probably relevant for everyone on the panel is there is some representation in advertising, but it's often misrepresentation. So it's almost a caricature of who this audience could be. It's a stereotype or kind of a caricature. So the real life, the things that people who are, let's say, 67 or 82, the things that make them say, they get me, like that speaks to me, that captures my reality. That's where when older people do appear in advertising, that's where advertisers are often missing the mark.
For sure. Actually, we've had some conversations about that on the consortium, haven't we, Kristen? About how to represent that target audience and what can fall flat. Over to you.
Thanks so much. So I have a couple of best practices to share with everyone. I'll get into more specifically as I talk them through. But the first is promote choice. Create surveys that are screen reader ready, offer voice to text, offer subtitles for videos. And what's really interesting is that screen reader ready doesn't just make the research experience more accessible for people who use screen readers. All of the attention that we pay to make sure the survey is working well with a screen reader is going to pay off for everyone who takes our survey. And that's all about making participant experience a priority. Go old school, incorporate a few live pre-tests. I had the pleasure to do that a few months ago, not necessarily with a people with disabilities audience, but with a general audience. And we heard loudly and clearly that the things that we did to make a particular case study that I worked on with Verizon more accessible, things like making sure all scale points were labeled and avoiding what feels like it's simple and feels like it moves quickly, like it a lot at the 5, don't like it at all at the 1. But what I heard people tell me in the pre-test was, I don't really know what that middle box stands for. I don't know what that number 3 stands for. I kind of know what the one close to the end and then one close to the other end knows, but what does that middle box stand for? And people don't enjoy taking a survey where there's ambiguity. They want to feel good about what they're doing, and they want to feel like they understand and that they're really able to give an answer that represents how they feel. So see how a focus on accommodations for people with disabilities are things that make the participant experience better for everyone. my colleagues on this call have talked about this one already. It's about having hard conversations and making accessibility a requirement of survey and qualitative platforms. And Maria and Dawn, I loved what you were saying. All of our panel providers will say, well, sure, we have people with disabilities represented. How? What type of disabilities? What does your screener survey look like when you recruit people to a panel? And the same with our platform providers. Many of them will point to the global web accessibility standards for people with disability. But when it actually comes to the programmer that you'll be working with, they're going to have a range of knowledge and experiences on how to make a grid that really truly can work with a screen reader, or how to use headings in the appropriate way to facilitate and make the screen reading experience as easy as possible. And I'll stay with grids for a little bit, because grids, I have heard people say, oh, you can never use grids with a screen reader, never. That's actually not true. We just can't use grids that are 25 statements long by 7 different multi-point options across the heading. We need to just be very aware of, what do I need to put in a grid, and when does a grid help get me the best answers instead of hindering getting the best answers?
And I think that goes back to, who likes to answer those questions? Like, no one in any
Absolutely.
target audience wants
Absolutely.
the 23 option by 7, you know.
That's exactly right. Yep.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that's what's really been eye-opening about being a part of this consortium that Kristen and I are both involved with. I actually also heard an excellent presentation last week at Quirks by a group called understood.org, who was talking about neurodiversity. So even within the accessibility audience, what are you doing from a neurodiversity lens and standpoint? I would also say, just to circle back on my personal soapbox about all of this, is going back to, if you can get people in the study, make sure they can participate in the study. So talk to your vendors, talk to your platforms, make sure, if I am trying to include these differently abled participants into the study, can they then use the tools? Because what you don't want to do is invite people in and then have them have a bad experience because of a software tool or platform capability.
Right.
So,
I was sharing with all of you last week when we were talking. I also have like a passion for the neurodivergent aspect of the disabled population. And, I'm not even comfortable putting it all together under that term, but that is, people with disability is a term that is recognized and used often. But I have an 18-year-old who just graduated high school, thank you, Lord. And he has had ADHD diagnosed since he was 7. And he came home one day and he said, Mom, that midterm was 90 multiple choice questions. How was I ever going to do that? And I'm thinking to myself, how would I ever do that? How would anybody ever do that? But yet we're still putting 4 series of scaled statements or scaled questions in our surveys, each of them with 20 to 25 questions. And so when we look and we see that, gee, about 50% agreed with everything, well, we call that straight lining. And that's another thing that you want to ask, and ask your panel providers and your programmers, what are we doing to catch people who are just not engaged with our survey, and what can we do to help prevent that type of disengagement? And a lot of the best practices for making surveys accessible will help in that regard for all respondents.
excellent segue. Let's go there. Let's go to the all. So we're going to do a quick, because the panelists as a group ended up having a lot of questions for each other during the process of developing this webinar. So we're going to have a little bit of inter-panel Q&A while the participants fill up the Q&A with your own questions. So we've got some conversations that we want to have. I'm actually going to stop sharing my screen because let's just chat. And then I can't wait to hear from anyone else in the audience. But I want to go back to Dawn because I think let's go back to this idea of this intersectionality. And I know that you had some questions kind of around how the other target audience experts think about that.
Yeah, because the way we define intersectionality is it's kind of like when these two areas of what we would say underserved, marginalized, any way you want to term that, communities sort of come together, and it creates an even bigger imbalance for that person. So if you are, some of the big intersectionalities for Black is like Black in gender, right? So Black, being a Black man has increasing difficulties in certain things, and being a Black woman has increasing things. So together those intersectionalities come together. Same with like Black and income is another big one for us. And so one of the questions I had in talking with the group is just, where are those big intersectionalities for you guys, and then how do you think about them? Because we do think about when a project comes in, what is this project, what is this category, and are there intersectionalities we need to make sure that when we're recruiting, we're looking at through that lens. So I'm just curious what you guys are thinking.
I think I can jump in on that one. I mean, that's obviously with the aging population, everybody filters on into it, yet the experience is going to be very different depending on a lot of different factors. So certainly race and ethnicity, also socioeconomic status in the US or elsewhere, and gender plays a role too, for sure. I mean, there's a lot with, as women age, and they're making a lot of the purchase decisions for the household, but they, if they are single, then it could be more challenging economically for them because often they haven't earned as much throughout their lifetime. But when we're looking at an older population, the first cut that we do is based on age groups. So we really do want to make sure that we're balanced to US Census by age and by bands of age. And then within that, we're looking for gender. And within that, we're also looking for race and ethnicity and income. So those are the big things that we hit on. And there are a lot of other things too. Katrina mentioned at the top of the webinar, we could do a whole series on this and talk about many, many other groups. And that's true here too. Sexual orientation is a big one, particularly as you think about senior living and you have a time of life where people are starting to come back together potentially for more communal living again. There are just different things to consider. So it depends a little bit on the topic exactly that we're researching, but I think the main breaks are age, gender, race, ethnicity, and income for us.
I want to underscore that because we do a lot of financial services research at No. And when we are talking to older populations, we really want to make sure that we have people with similar circumstances in those older, if we are talking about, income is one thing, but if you're talking about retirement and you're talking about, life insurance or, drawing out your retirement funds, we want to make sure that we have cohorts that feel cohesive so that they can speak freely with each other. So I'll just weigh in on that.
Yeah, and for me, I'm going to jump in from the other lens. Like one of the key core tenets of designing for accessibility is radical simplicity. Really focus on taking out the jargon, streamlining your text. And that should never, ever, ever be conflated with dumbing a survey down or dumbing a discussion guide down. What that does is it helps people who are perhaps neurodivergent. It will help people who are perhaps using a screen reader. It'll help avoid cultural missteps or cultural assumptions that certain phrases or your terms work and apply and are thought of the same way across ethnicity and across race and across country of origin. So the idea of radical simplicity when you're coming at it through the lens of making sure your survey is accessible benefits the intersectionality that you're going to find within all of the populations we're talking about today. And it should never be confused with dumbing something down. You can still get your rich insights and your depth of understanding on something by using simple language, and it will help everyone.
And we actually have an attendee who's posted a question that is very similar to a conversation that we were planning to have anyway. So I'm going to go there because the idea was, I think, Kristen, you had originally had a question for Dom around group composition and how you think about kind of dividing and sectioning out and how many subgroups do you have to have. And so we have an attendee who has asked if the idea of a nationally representative study, is it dead? And if not, how do we handle this? How do we handle, how many types of specialty firms they need to have involved and how do they deal with all that? I'm not sure who wants to take that one. Don, do you want to start with that?
Okay, yeah, no, I don't think it's dead, but I do. We were talking about this before, and so the point of view that we typically have is it depends, like everything else, on what your objectives are. So the reality is that unfortunately we live in a place where there are just different experiences and different behaviors, particularly when we talk about Black consumers. I'm probably the same if we were talking to Hispanic or other consumer groups, where people behave differently, right? There are just these cues here. And so when I talk about whether or not you need to do Black only groups or a Black moderator, things like that, to me, it's a hack more than anything else, right? Like you have 60 minutes to get to some kind of level of depth. And there is a hack there. If I walk into the room and I see someone who looks like me, that I automatically assume will get what it is that I'm saying. I can let my guard down faster. I can talk to you more. Instead of me trying to figure out, is that person really an ally? Are they not an ally? How are they going to use this? Do they really care? And those things that are going through the back of a lot of, particularly when I speak for Black consumers, a lot of those minds. So if what you're trying to do is get depth of like, I'm trying to understand whether it's in ethnography, I'm trying to understand more about their experience, their barriers, things like that. A hack is put someone that looks like them or put them in a surrounding where there are others like them, where you almost become someone that they ignore and they're talking to each other, right? And then you can get a lot of that too. That's what I would say is the big thing. If you're talking about like, should we do a purple package or a cream package, or maybe like basic things about the brand or basic category things, you may not need that. It's really when you start trying to get personal about their experiences with the world where you have this hack that's there that I would recommend to just get you there faster.
Yeah, there are some categories that are specific about that. Like I've been doing research about beauty. And when you're doing beauty, you definitely need to partner with a Black moderator, because beauty, there are some specific needs that you won't even understand when you are talking to consumers if you are not a Black consumer as well. With Hispanics, it's similar, but I think that is stronger, especially with the beauty category or hair care categories. That I do recommend you partner with a Black researcher that understands that from the personal level, that the category as well.
And I would say that's an opportunity to make sure you get those expert partners in initially to help you decide
Exactly.
if you need to do that, right? So I think that's, yeah, you probably need some experts up your sleeve to decide in the design phase if and how you need to bring in people in the research phase. I think we do that a lot. We do hey, we're doing a study about this. We've got these criteria points, like we're a small business, we're going to need some help. In what ways, and at which stages of this project are we going to need some help?
And when you guys, go ahead.
Thanks. I want to build actually, Dawn, on what you and Maria are saying about it really depends on what you're studying. If you are doing, and I also want to start it by saying that we don't quota on persons with disabilities in our studies. In the case study that we did with Verizon, we asked the question, do you identify as a person with disabilities? Yes, no. We did ask what kind, but you don't necessarily have to. We did ask about use of accessible technology, but we are not planning on quoting unless we are looking at a concept test for any client or digging into a topic that the client is designing for people with disability, or even if they feel like, I think this might have a unique and interesting application, then we would go about doing a specific and special recruit, and we probably recommend qual with people who have a certain kind of disability that the client hypothesizes would benefit most from the product or service.
Yeah. And I just, a quick add when we're talking about representativity, don't unnecessarily limit your sample, which is what often happens with age groups when people are putting in, when clients are building out the brief and they're putting in the specs. They may say 18 to 49 or 18 to 54. Think really hard. Do you need to cap it at 49? Do you need to cut it off at 54? And you very well may not need to. You might be surprised to learn how older consumers are interacting with your category, your brand, your product. And then if it's a concept test, what do they think about it? So there's a lot of learning there that you could be missing by putting that cap on the age.
Yeah, we have a screener starter, which is kind of our basic questions that we make sure we really look at each year and make sure we're happy with them. And in part based on my connection with Dana, I was like, let's see how high we can get the max age without anyone noticing. Like, let's see if we can go to 70, 75 and just, see who pushes back and why they push back, and start having conversations about, these folks with income to spend, who spend in your category, who qualify in every other way. Let's have a tough conversation about why you might not want to hear from them if that's the case.
I love that.
For instance, related to Dana with Hispanics, like we tend to forget the older Hispanics, but we also forget that, for instance, with Gen Zers or even younger generations, the influence of the parents of the older generations is so strong. Like for us, grandparents or our parents still have a lot of influence in our decisions. So forgetting about those older audiences and understanding their point of view, we are missing a big part of the findings. Happens with Gen Zers, happens with different audiences, because we have a lot of respect and we trust and we follow what older generations are doing, and we accommodate and we adjust, of course, but we also try to follow what they think and their traditions. So it's important to, even with Hispanic, and we're together. It's not only about being Hispanic or older. It's like older Hispanic or older generations have an important relationship with and influence, sorry, with Hispanics. So we cannot forget them either.
Totally. I have an eye on the clock and I have an eye on Dawn's flight. So I think we're going to do a couple follow-up questions here, because thank you all for populating the Q&A. I will also circulate the questions to the panelists if there's anything we don't get to answer live, so that they have a chance to give some feedback. But Dawn, if you can handle a couple, I'm going to try to combine these follow-up questions for you. And then there's a couple for Maria, but that will allow you to log off and run to the gate potentially. So yeah, there's some questions from Stacy about, she's embarking on this project as a white moderator and really wanting to make sure that she's successful. So just any tips for in terms of conducting herself, and I actually really love the follow-up question of any cues that she knows she's doing a good job. She's getting candor and she's getting honest feedback.
Yeah, and it sounds like the focus groups, the way I read them, is that it's a group of Black patients versus like one Black patient and then six others. And so what I would say here is that you're actually in a pretty good position, because what I would do is I would act as a facilitator, because like Katrina's doing a great job here of allowing the discussion to happen among the group versus with you. That's the first thing, because all they're looking for are the cues that say this is a safe space to have discussions. And so sometimes just knowing that I have people in the room that share a similar story, allow that to happen. And then I think that if you're going to be talking about things specifically to race, or you want to get at Black patients and what it is like with that, I think it's okay to like address the elephant in the room. Like, you are the one white person in the room, and people respect that. And it sort of goes to the lens itself, to the lens of like, I get that race is not a bad word. It's okay to say white, Black, Hispanic, et cetera. I think we sort of get all in our feelings and emotions about it. It is what it is. And so I think being able to have that discussion in a very like humble way is good as well. I think that the other piece here is just the fact that if you are moving into this space in terms of cues and things like that, the cues is when they're not talking. Like, and the other cues is that we talk a lot with our eyes and with our and things like that. And so understanding that, if you're seeing that happen across the room, hey, what does that mean? Just tell me what that means. Like, it's okay to be that way as well. But like, I don't think it's anything that I think it's something that you should welcome in terms of a discussion. And I think fostering that discussion among the group, I think will get you some really great insights. And using the fact that you're not the Black moderator often will help too. Like, explain it to me. I don't get it. Often is an okay thing as well, particularly when they feel like they're in a safe space.
Yeah, I have to say, when we have not had all the resources we've needed to, I have had to, dump my ego in the corner and say, I don't get it. Please tell me. Please tell me, because I want to understand. I also want to address the note in the webinar chat about no Asian representation on the panel. Honestly, it's no intentional omission. This webinar came out of a series of presentations that these folks did between Quirks Dallas and IA Annual that generated some social buzz around the through lines. So we grabbed the presenters from those presentations for this particular webinar. I definitely think that it is extremely important to include Asian research experts in your conversation. Shout out to our partner, IRSM at Sparkle Insights, who's doing some great thought leadership work on how to make sure to include their voices. Yeah, so no overt omission. This just, it was a snowball that happened, and we started to see the through lines, and we thought we would all get together and talk about it. So yes, no obvious omission there at all. We also have some questions for Maria. Yes, of course. Curiosity to be better is what all of this is about, right? If we're not curious about all these audiences, and that's our job here. Basically, that's what we all share as an industry, curious cats. Hopefully, right? So we have some questions from Maria around, there's a few different questions from Bill around socioeconomic status around race and nationality. So sort of back to that intersectionality questions, how do you kind of think about where you draw the lines in terms of where you see the differences on which demographic lines? And there was also an earlier question from Kiana about recommended approach about screening out white presenting Hispanic Latin respondents. And I don't know if that's a thing and if it should be a thing. So you can tackle one or both of those in whichever order you'd like, Maria.
I'll start with the first question in the QA. Well, we as Hispanics, we consider ourselves white. That's the reason why we have to separate the question of race and ethnicity, because we consider ourselves white, even though if we compare to whites, maybe we are brownier. But if you ask me, I consider myself white. I love that the questions are separated, because I hated when I had surveys or things that I had to answer where I had to choose between white and Hispanic. Most Hispanics, especially depending on the country, will consider themselves white or mixed races. We have also Black, especially if they're from the Caribbean, Dominican Republic, or some specific country. We have a lot of Black influence in Colombia. For instance, I'm originally from Colombia. So that's a tricky one, because it depends on how you perceive yourself. So most Hispanic will perceive. We can even have some ones that perceive themselves Asian, because there are some Asian influence in some countries like Ecuador or Argentina, even included there. So it's more about like the way that we screen out, that we want to make sure like we have a representative sample is, let's start with years living in the United States. So if they were born here, language is key. And that's a way that we're going to conduct the research, because if they don't speak English, they cannot be in a group, or same, because we have the Hispanics that have been here for a longer period of time and do not speak Spanish or don't feel comfortable having an entire conversation in Spanish. So that's another one that is important. We also check country of origin, and we make sure that we have something that is representative of the market and the representative of the US region. So mostly Mexicans, but also have some composition of South Americans and Central Americans. So that's the way that we make sure that we have like a representative sample, more than screening out white Hispanics, because we are white, or we could, at least we consider ourselves white. I don't know if that's a question that you had for me. And in terms of socioeconomic levels, that's an interesting one, because in Latin America, that's key. That's the way that we design the research. When I moved here, for me, it was confusing, not segmenting the group by socioeconomic level and having all the countries together in the same group. That took me years to understand and to accept that. I know that is more related to budget. Like if clients could do it, they will have groups with only Mexicans, with only Venezuelans, and things like that. Unfortunately, there is no budget for that. So what we do is study what is more representative, and the core of the Hispanic audience tends to be more like mid-incomes or incomes that are below $100,000 per year for a household income. So we try to accommodate to what is representative, but it also depends on the objective of the client. So sometimes, like for instance, Miami, it's a big Hispanic market, but it's not the most representative one, because it's more affluent. But when we want affluent Hispanics, Miami is a good one. It's just that it's not Mexican. So then you have another variable there that have to keep into consideration. So I would say it all depends on the client's objective. There are clients, if they want to go with people with higher incomes, higher educational levels, then we will include them. But if not, because of the budget constraint, we have to go with what is the most representative one, that is more like in the medium segment.
And then from a Black consumer standpoint, like we definitely, it's same thing, like it's a big difference in socioeconomic status. And so we do want to make sure that depending on what the client wants and needs, we're representative of that. It is difficult to have those two groups in the room because even though there might be some part of the story that's similar, there is a big disconnect, just like it would be probably with any socioeconomic difference there. The biggest challenge that we find with Black consumers is that the databases and the recruiting, the panels and things like that skew lower income. So it is really hard to find those higher income groups. And when I say higher income, I'm not even talking about like extreme higher income, just like, 75K and above, or from a household income, it's difficult. So there's often this push pull where like there are questions of, can we relax this part of the screener? And we say there's a big difference here in their story. So we push for that to not be the case as much as possible.
Fantastic. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for the really well thought out questions and conversation. I just wanted to say, we have a couple minutes. Anyone on the panel want to add anything or mention anything that we haven't covered, or any other examples of universal gains by making sure all of these audiences are included?
I promise you, Dawn, I was going to do this if it didn't come up organically. I would love for you to talk a little bit about that idea of when we focus on the fringe, we improve things in ways that never would have happened if we didn't focus on the fringe, at least in part. If you could share that with us, what we talked about last week.
Yeah, I was saying that, like, so Mahogany Insights, we have these 5 beliefs about why we exist. And one of the big ones is the fact that like innovation and ideation often happens on the fringes. And that's where a lot of these consumers represented today fall. And so when we think about a bell curve, often we're like trying to solve for the big people in the middle because that's like the big piece of it. But all the needs that are unmet often are happening in the fringes, which is where you come up with these great big ideas, these new influences, et cetera. And these groups that are on this call right here, that's often where they lie. That's where they are having to make compensating behaviors to sort of meet in the middle, et cetera. So when you have those opportunities to do that, it can widen what your overall opportunities, what your overall innovation, your overall ideation can come from there. So we had an example with a hair care where we had a very blonde, white, fine hair care brand that's well known that just said, like, I really just want to understand fragile, what we would call fragile, kinky kind of hair, right? And just understanding what that need is. And through that, they were able to understand, how do you create gentler, better shampoos? How do you talk about curly hair and wavy hair and textured and things like that? How do you clean differently? And that it just really expanded their overall profile by really looking at this group that was on the fringes at the time.
I love the hashtag focus on the fringe has got to, like, let's, because it's also hair care related. So I like the double entendre of that. So, so please, let's all keep this conversation going. As I mentioned at the beginning, there are many other target audiences that, when approached individually to meet their needs, can benefit the population as a whole. So thank you all for this small sampling today of these insights. We will definitely be passing around the recording. Feel free to share. Really, thank you all for the comments in the chat and the Q&A and all of the time from this amazing expert panel. Thank you, everybody. Have a good rest of your Tuesday.
Thanks, Katrina, for putting us on.
Bye, everybody.